They called me Danny back then, though names didn't stick in places like that. I'd been slinging gas and lukewarm coffee at the Starlight Desert Mart for what felt like a lifetime, but it was probably only pushing 4 months. Truth was, I wasn't trying to make a career out of it. I was running, plain and simple, outrunning the echoes of screeching tires and the phantom weight of lives I couldn't save. Arizona desert, I figured, was about as far as you get from anywhere that mattered. Dust, silence, an endless highway, my kind of peace. The Starlight was less of a mart and more of a glorified shack, hunkered down on the edge of nowhere. Highway snaked in one direction, sand in every other, perfect for disappearing, perfect for a ghost like me to blend into the background. The job was brain dead simpler pump gas, hawk stale snacks to the occasional lost soul, and kill time until the sun dared to peek over the horizon again. Nights were the real monsters out there. They stretched on forever, thick and heavy, swallowing sound whole. Only company was the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the crickets chirping their lonely song. Then, one night, the routine cracked. I just finished slopping lukewarm water across the gritty floor, pretending to mop when I saw it, something out of place. The counter was its usual chaotic self, candy wrappers, crumpled receipts, the ghosts of forgotten transactions. But tucked under the edge of the old cash register, half hidden in shadow, was a piece of paper. Not just any paper. This was aged, yellowed like old teeth. The kind of thing you'd expect to find in a dusty attic, not a desert gas station. My hand shook a little as I reached for it, the parchment feeling strangely heavy for its size. Thick, almost like vellum. A shiver crawled up my spine as I started to read. The handwriting was sharp, precise, almost unsettlingly neat against the aged paper. But it wasn't the writing that got to me. It was the words themselves. Not instructions, not really. Something else. The first lines were cold, mechanical, like they were etched by a machine, not a human hand. Despite the years, the ink was stark black, biting into the yellowed surface. Each letter seemed to pulse with a weird energy, a pressure that made my fingers tighten around the brittle edges. Like the paper itself might disintegrate if I didn't hold on tight enough. I took a breath and started reading aloud, the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue, like some kind of twisted incantation. Rule 1 at exactly 1200 AM. You must step behind the counter and stand still for 1 minute. Do not look at the clock. Do not move. You will know when the time has passed. If you move before the minute is complete, the cycle will restart. Gore cycle. Restart. What kind of joke was this? Rule 2. Mop the floor in the back room for exactly 1 minute and 12 seconds. The mop must remain on the floor for the full time. If it is lifted before that time has passed, you must start again, regardless of progress. Ridiculous. My frown deepened. Who wrote this? What was the point? But even as I scoffed, a strange pull tugged at me. I sensed that this wasn't something to dismiss. It was like the words themselves were reaching out, hooking into some buried part of me. I ran a hand through my hair, the desert air suddenly feeling colder against my skin, but I kept reading, compelled. Rule 3 at 1:30 am, the bell by the door will ring once. You must walk to the back door, open it, and immediately close it without turning around. If you hesitate or turn to look, you will lose the next day. Lose the next day. What did that even mean? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. But there was no time to dwell on it. The rules marched on, demanding attention. Rule 4, if someone enters and asks for a specific brand of drink, you must retrieve it immediately. Failure to do so will trigger the end of the night's cycle. Rule 5 at 2:05 am, go outside and walk around the station 3 times. The path must be completed in under 90 seconds. If you do not complete the 3rd lap before the minute and a half is up, the cycle resets to 2:00 am. Rule 6, when the clock strikes 3:00 am, sweep the floor in front of the register in 3 equal sections. Each section must be swept for exactly 22 seconds. If the broom is lifted before that time, the clock will reset to 12:00 am, and you must start over. Rule 7, when the clock reaches 3:50 am, walk to the front door, open it, step outside, walk around the station once more. Do not look behind you. Do not speak. Rule 8, at 4:00 am you will hear a bell. It will be faint at first, then louder. You must wait until it stops before you can go back inside. If you enter too early, you will never leave. My hand went numb, the parchment slipping from my suddenly nerveless fingers. I stared at the yellowed paper on the counter, the words swimming before my eyes. This wasn't just odd. This was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. A knot twisted in my stomach, cold and tight. This wasn't some prank. This was something else entirely. The air in the tiny station seemed to thicken, the silence pressing in on me. Then it happened. The bell above the door, it rang. Once. Sharp and sudden, like a shard of glass shattering the quiet. My heart slammed against my ribs. 12 a.m. I looked up, almost against my will, at the old clock above the snack racks. Exactly midnight. The bell's echo still hung in the air, vibrating in my bones. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared back down at the parchment, the words leaping out at me, burning themselves into my brain. At exactly 12:12 a.m., you must step behind the counter and stand still for 1 minute. Do not look at the clock. Do not move. You will know when the time has passed. If you move before the minute is complete, the cycle will restart. Every second stretched, warped, as if time itself was fighting against me. The air grew heavy, almost solid. I glanced at the clock again, a quick, involuntary flick of my eyes. The second hand ticked, steady, relentless. But the silence of the silence was a living thing, pressing down, suffocating. I didn't understand why, but the first rule it felt vital, like it was the key to something I couldn't even name. Pushing myself off the counter, legs shaky and uncertain, I stepped behind the register. My body felt like it was resisting, heavy, reluctant, but my heart was a trapped bird, frantic, desperate to escape. No going back now. The rule had started. I turned, facing the wall, forcing myself not to look at the clock. Do not look at the clock. The words echoed in my head, a mantra, a command. I stood there immobile, arms hanging uselessly at my sides. The silence in the room became unbearable. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade, leaving me stranded in a void of sound. I could hear my own pulse, loud, frantic, and the shallow, rapid breaths rasping in my throat. A minute. Just a minute. I counted the seconds in my head, a desperate internal rhythm. 1, 2, 3, but the feeling of being watched, it was overwhelming. Something unseen, something just beyond the edge of perception, was observing me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and the weight of the silence intensified, pressing down like some invisible force. The clock ticked on, though I'd stopped hearing it moments ago. The bell, that single, jarring chime, still resonated somewhere deep inside me. I gritted my teeth, focusing on stillness. Not a twitch, not a flicker of movement. 30 seconds. My stomach clenched, a cold fist of dread. Why am I doing this? What's the point of any of this? But the rules, they were clear. I had to follow them. It felt like I owed it to something to see this through. I forced my breathing to slow, fighting back the rising panic. 30 seconds, 40. The air around me was getting thick, heavy. My vision darkened at the edges, blurring. For a heartbeat, the floor seemed to shift beneath my feet, twisting, stretching, then snapping back to normal. Just a trick of the light. My mind screamed. Another click of the clock, the second hand jerking forward. The minute was up. Or was it? It didn't feel like it had passed. Not in any normal way. My body was still locked in place, and time itself felt as stuck. Like I was trapped in a single, endless moment. The room seemed to deepen, the corners dissolving into shadow. Then, just as suddenly as it had descended, the weight lifted. I'd done it. The minute had passed. Relief flooded through me, weak and shaky. I stumbled away from the counter, my legs trembling beneath me. I hadn't moved. I hadn't looked at the clock. No matter how insane it seemed, I'd followed the first rule. But something had shifted. As I walked back across the small space to the counter, the atmosphere had changed. The air was different, colder. Charged, I turned, finally, to look at the clock. It was still 12:00 a.m. Blinking, disbelieving, stared at the clock face. No, it couldn't be, but it was. The second hand was still sweeping forward, ticking out the seconds, but the minute hand frozen, locked solid, and the hour hand unmoving, stubbornly fixed at 12. 12 a.m. My heart lurched, a heavy sickening thud that echoed in the sudden, oppressive silence of the gas station. The quiet itself seemed to be squeezing the air from my lungs. The air grew colder, thicker, as if time itself had curdled. I backed away, my head spinning. This was wrong, so wrong. Normal wasn't supposed to be like this. I'd stood still for a full minute, just like the rule said. Why? Why hadn't time moved on? My fingers trembled as I snatched the parchment from under the counter again, my eyes racing over the words. No mistakes. The instructions were clear, unambiguous. I'd follow them exactly. At exactly 12:00 a.m., you must step behind the counter and stand still for 1 minute. You will know when the time has passed. But I hadn't known. The moment had felt endless, stretched, as if the rule itself had trapped me inside a moment I couldn't escape. I started to pace, the strange unease gnawing at the edges of my awareness. There had to be an explanation, a logical one. This was a mistake, right? Maybe the clock was broken. Maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But even as I tried to rationalize, I couldn't shake the feeling, the weight, the pressure squeezing in, warning me. My gaze drifted back to the counter, then to the door. The bell was silent now, but I could still hear its echo in my head, a phantom ringing in the stillness. My eyes flicked back to the clock. Still 12:12 a.m., and that's when I heard it, a sound from the back room, a soft scratching. My heart stopped. I froze a strain to hear, every muscle tense, like something was being dragged across the floor. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, punctuated by dull thuds. I gasped a choked breath. The back room. The parchment, the rules: do not enter the back room. Never close the doors at midnight. I hadn't closed the door, but the sound, someone was in there. Before the sound, there had been only silence. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the old building settling, normal, everyday sounds. This was different, deliberate. My feet rooted to the floor. I hesitated, but I couldn't just ignore it. I had to know. I had to find out what was making that noise. The scratching intensified, frantic now, like nails tearing at wood, broken by heavier, sickening thumps. I took a deep breath and moved slowly, cautiously, towards the back room door. Each step felt like stepping into the unknown. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, fingers brushing against the cold metal. I stopped, my palm hovering over the knob. The rules. I couldn't open the door at midnight. But something inside me rebelled against the stillness, against the silence, against the rules themselves. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I needed answers. I had to know what was happening. And then, without another thought, I opened the door. The scratching stopped. The air went dead silent, heavy, expectant. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet. I peered into the back room. Except for a single, flickering bulb casting long, dancing shadows, it was black. Dust motes danced in the weak light, swirling in the stale air. Shelves crammed with forgotten supplies loomed in the gloom. But nothing, no sign of movement. No indication of what had made that sound. My boots crunched on the gritty floor as I stepped inside, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But I ignored it, pushing deeper into the room. The silence was deafening, oppressive. I moved forward, eyes darting, searching the shadows. Still nothing. No one. Then, as I turned to leave, I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, then growing stronger, clearer, rising from the deepest corner of the room, where shadows clung like velvet. A voice. Emerging from the darkness. Scarcely audible at first, then the words sharpened, cutting through the silence. You ought not to have opened the door. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned slowly, heart pounding, towards the voice. And then I saw it. The source of the sound, just beyond the reach of the flickering bulb, swallowed by the deepest shadows in the corner of the room. A figure still. Man-shaped. His face hidden, obscured by the darkness, or something else. Something heavy, hanging in front of his face. Again the voice, closer now, louder. More forceful. You've broken the rule. You won't be leaving now. The room went colder, the air turning icy, biting at my skin. The man stepped forward, out of the shadows, and I saw it then. The thing obscuring his face. A heavy, rusted meat hook. His shadow stretched impossibly long across the dusty floor, reaching for me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I turned, stumbling back, feet slipping on the loose grit. I tried to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to be closing in, the small room shrinking, suffocating. And then silence. Sudden, absolute silence. The voice gone and gone, vanished, and the clock, the wall clock, still stubbornly, impossibly, showing 12:20 a.m., frozen. That's the only word for it. Frozen in place in the black stillness of the back room. The air was thick, suffocating, clinging to my skin like a shroud. The smell of stale dust hung heavy in my nostrils, overpowering even the phantom scent of gasoline that usually permeated the station. Over it all, the silence pressed down, a crushing weight. I could barely hear my own breathing, but my mind was screaming. What just happened? Who was that man? What did he mean? I broke the rule. And why was the clock still stuck at midnight? My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back out of the back room, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft, unsettling click. I leaned against it, the rough wood pressing into my back, trying to steady my shaking hands, forcing myself to breathe. The rules, they had to mean something. There had to be a reason for all of this. None of it made any sense. But it felt real. Too real to dismiss as a hallucination or a bad dream. I pushed myself off the door, turned, and looked back at the clock across the station. Still Hell's Horror AM. The hour hand hadn't budged. Only the second hand moved, ticking relentlessly, pointlessly around the frozen face. Time had stopped. Or something had stopped it. My heart hammered in my chest again, a frantic, trapped bird. My brain raced, searching for any rational explanation. Broke clock, sleep deprivation, stress. But deep down, I knew those excuses were hollow. Whatever was in that back room, the figure, the whispers, they were real. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. I was trapped. Trapped in this moment, in this place, and the rules were the key. Somehow, I moved back towards the counter, my feet dragging the parchment. I had to look at the parchment again. It lay there, slightly crumpled where I dropped it, under the sickly yellow glow of the fluorescent lights. As I picked it up, my hands still trembling, my eyes scanned the words again. You will know when the time has passed. But I hadn't known. Not really. I still didn't understand what was happening. I could feel the cycle dragging me down. Keep out of the back room. Never close the doors at midnight. Had I disobeyed the rules? Had opening the back door had that triggered all of this? Panic started to bubble in my chest, hot and suffocating. The rules, they said nothing about another person in the room. Nothing about whispers. But I had heard them. I had seen him. I turned again, almost against my will, towards the back room door. The single bulb flickered weakly in the darkness beyond. Should I go back? Was that part of the rules I was supposed to complete? Or was I already too late? Too late for what? Then, the bell. A ringing of the door. My heart leaped, a jolt of pure adrenaline. Not the usual muted chime of a car pulling up to the pumps. This bell was louder, sharper, more insistent, urgent, like it was summoning me. I turned, facing the front of the station, and saw him. The man. The one with the torn cloths, the one from the back room. He was standing just inside the entrance, perched on the edge of the counter like he'd been there all along. Staring straight ahead, his eyes wide, unblinking, fixed on something unseen. Waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again. I hadn't heard him arrive. Hadn't heard the bell for him. And yet, there he was, watching me with that same unsettling, unnerving gaze. His voice, low and raspy, barely a whisper, cut through the silence. The cycle is almost complete. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask questions, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, dry, constricted. The clock, it remained frozen at 1200 a.m. Reaching inside his threadbare jacket, the man pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Another parchment, just like the one I'd found. He held it out to me, his hand trembling slightly. Without thinking, I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the age paper. And the room shifted again. As soon as my skin touched the parchment, the air grew thick, heavy with a suffocating sense of foreboding. You have to complete them, he rasped, his voice barely audible. Then the bell rang again. But this time it was different, quite almost distant, like a funeral toll. Turning back towards the entrance, I looked again, but the man was gone, vanished, just like that. Into thin air. I spun back around, searching for the clock, and then I saw it. The second hand, it had moved. Just a fraction, but it had moved. 12:01 a.m. The sound of the cloth-made tick-tock filled the room again, each tick echoing in the oppressive silence of the gas station. Staring at the clock face, a wave of nausea washed over me, cold and sickening. The second hand clicked forward again. My heart slammed in my chest. 12:01 a.m. Exactly the time I'd first noticed the clock was stuck. I looked around, my stomach churning. The man's sudden appearance, his cryptic words. The bell, everything felt disjointed, unreal. Uncertainty gnawed at me, a relentless, corrosive fear. Looking down at the parchment in my hand, I saw it was identical to the first. The stranger's parchment. The one he'd given me before he disappeared. I unfurled it, my eyes desperately searching the words, hunting for answers, for solutions. But this time, the words were different, more urgent, more sinister. Once the cycle resets, the hour will begin again. You must follow all instructions exactly. Time will pass when the final action is completed. I looked back at the clock. The second hand had barely moved. This couldn't be happening, not again. I'd done everything the rules said. The counter was untouched. The backroom door closed. There hadn't been another bell. But the man, he had been real, hadn't he? The feeling that the station wasn't the same place I'd walked into hours ago, it was overwhelming. The sense of being watched, it hadn't gone away. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't name. Again, I glanced at the clock and saw it. Steadily, relentlessly ticking, but nothing else changed. Complete the actions without error. The cycle will repeat till you finish them all. I stared at the parchment, my hands shaking. I had to pay them off. But how? What had I missed? My feet felt heavy, weighted down like I was wading through water. I moved, almost against my will, back towards the counter. I laid the parchment down, my palm flat on the cold surface of the register. It vibrated faintly beneath my hand. Time felt like it was looping, twisting around me. The clock, the faint, distant bell, it all felt surreal, detached like I was trapped in some kind of twisted déjà vu. My head swam, reeling from everything that had happened. I stumbled towards the back room again, drawn by some morbid curiosity, some desperate need to understand. As I stepped inside, the single bulb flickered overhead, casting long, grotesque shadows. The faint buzzing of the light only amplified the tension, tightening the knot in my stomach. My throat was parched, raw, but the scream that clawed at my insides wouldn't come out. Something about the way the back room felt it pulsed with a strange, unsettling vitality, like something alive was just beyond the walls, just out of sight. I couldn't stay in there. Not again. I backed out, leaving the darkness behind. I had to finish the cycle, whatever that meant. The space around me remained still, silent, expectant. Again, I turned to the clock, still anchored at 2001 AM. Rule 2. Mop the floor in the back room. Exactly 1 minute and 12 seconds. I couldn't afford to break another rule. Not now. Not after everything. I had felt something watching me in that room before. And now, with time frozen, with the weight of the cycle pressing down, I could only imagine what would happen if I failed again. Pulling the mop from the corner, dipping it into the bucket of frigid, dirty water, I started to mop. Slowly, methodically, the dark water spread across the gritty floor, leaving a trail of dampness in its wake. Watching the seconds tick by on the unmoving clock, I felt my nerves stretch tighter, each moment an agonizing eternity. Concentrating on the floor, on the rhythmic swish of the mop, I tried to block out the fear, the confusion, the creeping dread. My breath hitched in my throat, shallow, rapid. 1 minute 12 seconds. Not long, but forever. Not stopping, not pausing. I counted in my head a silent, desperate litany. The second hand of the clock it seemed to crawl, each second dragging on longer than the last. As I counted, I reached the final stroke. My hand trembled, the mop still resting on the damp floor. And then the clock, it clicked. Hell 12:02 AM. The floor was clean, spotless, and the silence around me, it was absolute. Total. My heart hammered in my throat, a frantic drum against my ribs. I stood there, frozen, momentarily suspended in time, waiting. The station felt colder now, colder than the desert night, colder than death. Like I'd crossed some invisible line, and nothing would ever be the same again. Then the bell. It rang. Once more, louder than before. The sound reverberated through the small station, filling the empty space with an almost unbearable pressure. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild, desperate rhythm. I moved back towards the front, drawn by some unseen force. Standing in the doorway, framed against the darkness, the man from earlier waited. He looked exactly the same. Unmoving, unreadable. He lifted a hand, slowly, deliberately, pointing at me. "You finished the chores," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The cycle ends now." My mouth opened, but no words came out. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to breathe. Then, finally, the clock changed. Not the end, not yet, but something shifted, something changed. The man stood in the doorway, his face still hidden in shadow, but his eyes were fixed on mine, burning with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. He was silent for a moment, then reached inside his jacket again, pulling out another piece of paper, exactly like the others. He held it out to me wordlessly. Shakily, I reached out and took it. The rules stared back at me from the yellowed parchment, stark black ink against aged paper. But these weren't the same rules. These were different, more final, more terrifying. The final task must be completed. You must open the door, step outside, leave the station, and do not look back. The cycle will be broken, and you will be free. Walk out of the station, get outside. I reread the final rule, my mind struggling to grasp the words. The rules had warned against leaving before the cycle finished. But could I really do this? Could I trust this new instruction? Could I trust him? Was this man even real? Or was he just another part of the trap? "Do not question," the man said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the swirling confusion in my head. "Do not hesitate." He stepped further into the doorway, his form solid, undeniably present. "You have to finish the work." His words hung in the air, heavy, final. He'd never spoken directly to me before, and his tone, it was clear, absolute, devoid of any doubt. The time had come, I had to do it. I spun around, my gaze fixed on the front door. The tolling of the bell had stopped, but the air around me still felt thick, suffocating, charged with an unseen energy. As I moved towards the door, my legs felt like they were filled with lead, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness of the station. I reached for the handle, my fingers clenching tightly around the cold metal. Slowly, deliberately, I turned it and pulled. The door swung open, and a rush of cool night air washed over me, carrying the scent of desert dust and something elsey, something wild, untamed. The desert stretched out before me, vast and desolate under the pale light of the moon. Long shadows clawed across the empty highway, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind. Feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, I stepped outside, then another step, and another, moving away from the station into the open expanse of the desert night. I didn't dare turn around. Not yet. The man's words echoed in my head. Do not turn around. I couldn't risk it, not now. Not after coming this far. I had no idea what would happen if I disobeyed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging me forward. One step, then another, then another. The station seemed to shrink behind me with each stride, the flickering fluorescent lights fading into the distance. The stillness of the desert enveloped me, pressing down heavy, expectant. It felt like 1,000 invisible eyes were watching me, peering out from the deep shadows that clung to the edges of the world. It was finished. The cycle ceased to be intact. The man's words, I focused on them, clinging to them like a lifeline. I felt free then. A fragile, tentative hope flickered within me. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was finally over. But even as the thought formed, a cold dread seeped into me, a chilling premonition that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the air around me turned frigid. A bone, deep cold that started in my marrow and spread outwards, stealing my breath. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something didn't feel right. The night, it was still. Too still. And the dread that had been dogging me all night, it surged back, stronger than ever, a tidal wave of icy fear. My heart lurched. Missed a beat, then another, almost against my will. I turned. I shouldn't have. I knew it the moment my head started to turn. I ought not to have turned around. The gas station was still there, exactly as it had been, but different. Now, the lights were brighter, harsher, more intense, bathing the dilapidated shack in an unnatural, sickly glow. And someone was standing in the doorway. Him, that man. He was watching me. His face still veiled in shadow, but his eyes burned in the gloom, flickering like dying embers. But this time I saw something else. In the distance, beyond the station, beyond the highway, other figures were emerging from the darkness, concealed in the shadows, moving towards the station, slowly, deliberately. I stumbled back, my feet dragging, as if the desert itself was pulling me back into that terrible cycle. I glanced at it. The clock. It had materialized above the gas station, hanging in the air, huge, impossible, and it was 12:00 a.m. Again, loud and deafening, the bell started ringing. I could hear it echoing in my skull, each clang a hammer blow against my sanity. The desert, it shimmered, distorted, like a mirage. The heat radiating up from the asphalt, even in the dead of night, felt oppressive, suffocating. Standing there, frozen, staring at the station, bathed in that terrible, unnatural glow. My breath seized in my throat again. The bell, it was ringing in my head now, louder, more insistent, unrelenting. A constant, agonizing reminder of the past I'd tried so desperately to escape. I ought never to have turned around. Motionless, the man in the doorway watched me from the shadows. His face, no longer hidden, was now starkly visible in the harsh light. Unnaturally pale, hollow eyes that seemed to see right through me, stripping away every pretense, every lie I told myself. And then I saw them, more people, emerging from the shadows, coalescing out of the darkness, moving towards the gas station, their bodies wrong, out of sync with the natural rhythm of life. They shuffled, slowly, deliberately, their movements jerky, mechanical, silent, ghostly. No sound of footsteps on the gravel, no rustle of clothing in the desert wind. They were coming for me. I couldn't run. My body screamed at me a silent, terrified protest, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed, as if some invisible force had tethered me to this place, to this endless night. My feet were frozen to the ground, trapped, caught in this never-ending cycle. The clock above the station ticked louder now, its second hand spinning faster, mocking my futile attempt to escape. The man moved forward, slow, deliberate steps, his voice ringing in my ears, low and terrible. You have completed the cycle. He stopped just outside the doorway, the shadows swallowing his lower face, leaving only those hollow, burning eyes visible. You were never meant to leave. I nodded, a slow, involuntary movement, incredulity flooding over me, drowning me. It couldn't be. I'd vanished. I'd followed the rules. I'd left the station. Just like the parchment said, I should be free. I should be, and then the terrible truth slammed into me. A physical blow that knocked the air from my lungs. I turned again, one last desperate glance at the clock. Time had reset. Again, the minute hand still stubbornly fixed at 1200 a.m., but the second hand it ticked forward. The cycle, it was never broken. It was always going to come back. A cold hand on my shoulder, icy fingers brushing against my skin. My body went rigid, every muscle locking in place. Slowly, dreadfully slowly, I turned, and there he was. The man, standing right behind me, his face blank, expressionless. But his eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, they held a terrible, knowing awareness. "It's too late," he whispered, his breath cold against my ear. "The rules are always the same. You will never escape. You will always return." The figures closed in around me, their jerky, mechanical motions like the workings of some broken machine. Their footsteps were audible now, a soft, shuffling drag across the gravel, closing the trap. They surrounded me completely, a silent, suffocating circle. The weight of the station, the weight of the desert night, pressed down, smothering me. The bell rang, deafeningly loud, louder than anything I'd ever heard. Then, a final toll, crisp, sharp, a last agonizing vibration that seemed to resonate through my very bones. And then darkness. The world I knew dissolved, fading into black. My body went stiff, unyielding. My mind a swirling, empty fog. I woke up behind the counter. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing softly just like they always did. The clock. I looked at the clock. 23:30 a.m. The bell above the door, it chimed. Once, and I understood you then. The cycle was underway, again. I had been here before. I would be here again. And again. And again. I could not leave. Not ever. I woke behind the counter. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting their sickly yellow glow across the familiar, dusty space. The clock. My eyes snapped to the clock. 12:30 a.m. Impossible. It couldn't be. But it was. The bell above the door chimed. Once. A sharp, clear tone that echoed through the empty station, a cold, unwelcome greeting. Understanding crashed over me. A wave of icy dread that stole my breath. I knew. I understood with a sickening certainty that settled deep in my bones. The cycle. It was underway again. And again. I was trapped. Truly, I had been here before. Countless times. It felt like, though time itself had lost all meaning. I would be here again, too. And again. A never-ending loop. A spiral of terror and repetition, bound to this desolate gas station, to these nonsensical rules, to the silent, spectral figures that emerged from the desert night. I could not depart. Not ever. The weight of that realization settled on me, crushing, suffocating. Hope, that fragile flicker that had dared to ignite when I stepped out into the desert, died, extinguished, leaving behind only a cold, hollow despair. Escape was an illusion. Freedom, a cruel joke. This gas station, this endless night, this cycle of rules and terror, this was my prison. My eternal damnation. I looked down at my hands, turning them over, flexing my fingers. They were real, solid, but they felt disconnected, like they belonged to someone else, someone caught in a nightmare not of his own making, yet utterly, inescapably his. I was Danny or whatever name I'd used before this one. But names didn't matter here. Identity didn't matter. Only the cycle mattered. The rules, the bell, the clock, and the silent, watching figures. The bell chimed again, a faint, distant echo of the midnight summons. 1:30 a.m. time, or what passed for time in this twisted reality, was still moving, however grudgingly. Rule 2 mopped the back room floor. 1 minute and 12 seconds. The thought was a lead weight in my stomach. Another repetition. Another meaningless task in an endless chain of meaningless tasks. But what choice did I have? Disobedience had brought only deeper terror, a tightening of the cycle's grip. Perhaps, just perhaps, if I followed the rules perfectly, flawlessly maybe something would change. A foolish hope, I knew, but it was all I had left. A sliver of delusion to cling to in the face of utter despair. With a sigh that was more a release of stale air than an expression of emotion, I pushed myself away from the counter. My legs were heavy, unresponsive, but they moved. They always moved. Drawn by the invisible threads of the cycle, I walked towards the back room door. The flickering bulb cast long, dancing shadows across the floor, mocking my every step. The back room waited, silent, expectant. The mop leaned against the wall in the corner, exactly where I'd left it. The bucket dirty water stood beside it, stagnant cold. I picked up the mop, the familiar weight a dull H in my arm, dipped it in the water, and began to mop. Slowly, methodically, one stroke, then another. The frigid water spread across the gritty floor. mirroring the coldness that had settled deep inside me. I counted the seconds in my head, each number a hollow echo in the silence of the room. The clock ticked on, somewhere out in the station, a relentless, mocking rhythm. 1 minute, 12 seconds, an eternity compressed into 72 heartbeats. I focused on the floor, on the swirling patterns of dirty water, trying to empty my mind, to become nothing more than a machine, performing a meaningless task. But the thoughts still crept in, insidious, unwelcome. Memories of the accident, faces of the people I couldn't save, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, and the whispers, always the whispers, echoing in the silence, promising endless repetition, eternal return. The clock clicked, 12:02 a.m. The minute and 12 seconds were up. The floor was damp, clean as it ever got in this forsaken place. I stood there for a moment, the mop heavy in my hand, the silence pressing down, suffocating. For what? For the next rule, for the next bell, for the next descent into terror. Then it came. The bell, louder now, more insistent, a jarring clang that ripped through the silence and sent a fresh jolt of fear through my weary body. The cycle continued. Unburned, and I was still here, trapped, forever bound to the starlight desert mart, to the endless night, to the rules, to the ghosts, to the cycle that would never, ever release me. This was it. This was eternity, and it had just begun.